Welcome to this module of the Budget and Finance Endorsement course of the State Library of Iowa. This module is all about free libraries aren't free. I'm Mary Ann Morey, Central District Consultant for the State Library of Iowa. At the completion of this module, you should be able to identify the costs behind free library resources and services, define budget sources for your public library, demonstrate a basic understanding of the various roles among your library team as it pertains to budgeting, and identify accreditation standards pertaining to funding aspects of the library. We often talk about free libraries, but that's really a misnomer. In reality, free libraries are a lot like a free puppy. And if you've ever fallen hopelessly in love with a free puppy, you know that there are really a lot of costs involved in raising one of them. The same thing is true for libraries. We tout these many free services and resources that we offer, but in reality, there are a lot of costs involved in providing all of those. Some of these costs might actually be underestimated. And of course, we still need to add in all of the other extra things that are expenses that are included in running a library. Things such as staff salaries, which is probably one of the highest categories in your budget. Programming supplies, think glue sticks and even speakers that you may have for some of your programs. Office supplies such as ink and toner and copy paper. Operational supplies, including the toilet paper that you have to buy for your library. Building maintenance, which might be planned, such as snow removal, or unexpected, such as plumbing expenses, which usually takes a few extra dollar signs. And the list just gets longer and longer until suddenly we have a huge cha-ching budget expense. So the big question becomes, who pays for all this stuff? Or what are the primary budget sources for public libraries? Which brings us to our second learning objective about defining budget sources for public libraries. Most all of Iowa's 500 plus libraries are city libraries. You can tell that by looking at the name. They're usually name of city, public libraries, such as you see on these Iowa samples here on the slide. So it makes sense that for most of our libraries, the primary funding comes from the city. The library is, after all, a city department. In our state, cities and counties are mandated by Iowa code to fund libraries through the 6.75 cent tax. Specifically, this Iowa code, section 256.69 says, each city within its corporate boundaries and each county within the unincorporated area of the county shall levy a tax of at least 6.75 cents per $1,000 of assessed value on the taxable property for the purpose of providing financial support to the public library of that jurisdiction. I know you're clapping your hands and thinking, isn't this great that all of the cities and counties have to provide funding to support the library? But before you get too excited, realize that this tax is actually an old amount. It's an amount established in the 1970s. The code's taxing amount is outdated and an inadequate minimum. You would not be able to keep your doors open on this amount. What's worse is that there are some libraries that aren't even receiving that minimum from their cities and counties. But the fact remains that for the overwhelming majority of Iowa's 500 plus public libraries, funding comes primarily from the library's city and county, but mostly from the city. You can see on this pie graph the amount, that the large amount comes from the city. County funding is a portion of this funding pie as well. But this shows you the extent of how much comes from the city, as I was saying earlier. You may be wondering what the other income category noted there includes. The following slides will show you some of those other types of income that fund public libraries in Iowa. While the state doesn't cover a lot of your budget, it does provide some income for your library via Enrich Iowa, which is an umbrella name that covers 3 different funding programs overseen by the state library. Those 3 funding programs are direct state aid, which provides funding to your library if it participates in the accreditation program and completes the annual survey. Open access, which is a reimbursement for items you loan to non-residents in other incorporated participating towns. And interlibrary loan reimbursement, which is a subsidy that you're paid for all of the items you loan to other libraries. Cities can gain some extra funding to help libraries through a special library levy of 27 cents. This levy is sometimes simply called the 27-cent levy. There are a few stipulations here. You've got to pass a petition and referendum first. The question is then put on the ballot in regular city elections in odd-numbered years only. It also requires a simple majority vote, and these levies often, but not always, pass. If you want to consider the levy, you'll want to start preparing for it way in advance. The State Library's website has more information available concerning this levy, and additionally, our law librarian, Mandy Easter, and I presented a webinar about the 27-cent levy, and that archived webinar is still available on our library website under the category of Library Levy. While your library does not receive any direct federal funds, those federal library dollars are given to the state library, which in turn passes along benefits to you. Federal dollars from the Institute of Museum and Library Services, or IMLS, cover a lot of the programs your state library offers for all public libraries in Iowa, including these: the Summer Reading Program, Early Childhood Literacy Training, Continuing Education and Endorsement, Databases, Building the Space Needs Grant, State Data Center, Iowa Center for the Book, which oversees the All Iowa Reads program, Silo Email and Interlibrary Loan, and PLOW, your state-sponsored website. Again, you don't receive the direct funding from federal dollars, but these furnished resources mean that your library don't have to pay, or doesn't have to pay much in the case of some databases, to receive the services and resources. Many libraries rely on grant funding to help with their budgets. If you are interested in grant funding for your library, you need look no further than your own library. In 2019, the State Library provided this online resource, Foundation Directory Online. It's a grant finding resource that enables nonprofits to enter their needs, such as their organization type, grant project type, and dollar amount needed, and in return receive a list of potential grantors. Talk with your district office staff for more information if your library hasn't yet promoted this resource on your website. A lot of our public libraries have separate nonprofit organizations that have been formed solely for the support of the library. These groups are known as Friends of the Library or the Library Foundation, or in the case of these two Iowa libraries, the two groups have combined into one organization known as the Friends Foundation. These groups conduct fundraisers on the library's behalf and generate monies that are used to supplement, not replace, the library's budget. Most of the time, the funding is used for special purchases above and beyond the library's normal budgetary expenditures, or the funds are used for a building campaign. More information about Friends and Foundations can be found on the State Library's website. Most libraries will have a guesstimated income amount designated as donations and anticipate a small amount as part of their regular budget. But occasionally, a library may receive a windfall of money through unexpected donations, such as a bequest or a special memorial gift. It is important to remember that any monies given to the library are city funds and must be reported to your city. Unexpected donations that far surpass your budget will require a budget amendment. Talk with your city clerk about this process. Here's our next learning objective: being able to demonstrate basic understanding of the various rules among your library team as pertains to budgeting at your library. Knowing the rules of your library team members can help you avoid a lot of headaches and budget blunders. When all the players of the team fulfill the role they're supposed to do, your budgetary aspects will be much smoother, even if the dollar amounts aren't higher. So, who all is on your library budget team? You have at least 5 team players: your city, your county, your library board, your library director, and the state library. Let's do a quick overview of each team member's role. The city's primary role is funding. Remember that cities hold the purse strings for the library. Cities determine the amount of city tax dollars that they allocate to the library's budget. This slide reminds us of all the city does regarding budgets and the financing of the library. In addition to providing a bulk of the library's budget, the city should be overseeing the payment of your library's invoices. It's the city clerk's role, or sometimes it might be a city finance officer's role, to do this. That same city employee should be providing financial reports in the form of budget reports to your library on a monthly or an as-needed basis. The city has a responsibility and obligation to account for public funds, so while it can't dictate how your library's budget is spent, it does need to know how those monies are spent. Counties determine the amount of rural tax dollars that they allocate to the library's budget, so the county's role is also funding. In most examples, counties determine the dollar amount and the libraries within the county determine the distribution formula, often based upon circulation of materials to rural patrons, but sometimes including a base amount for all libraries and or population considerations. Library boards have a great deal of authority over the library's budget. Although the city allocates the money, it's the board's authority and role to set up the annual budget with the line items and approve monthly bills. Thus, the library board's overall role can best be described as governance. Boards also need to understand that there are state laws regarding accountability of public funds. Cities have a better grasp of that, while boards seem less aware. But on the flip side, boards better understand their own authority as administrative boards better than some city councils understand it. Regarding accountability, boards need to remember that cities must account for all public dollars. It is imperative and legally required that libraries report to their cities all incomes and expenditures. The library director also has a long list of duties pertaining to his or her role within the budget team. It's the director who is working with the library's budget on a practically daily basis. Because of that, the library director's primary role in the budget process is management. Here are some basic duties of the director: drafting the annual budget, which the board approves, making the purchases, managing the spending, and pacing the spending throughout the year. Assuming the city clerk or finance officer is providing monthly financial reports to the director, it is then the director who in turn includes those reports for the board at each monthly meeting. And there's that understanding of public funds and accountability again. Library directors should have a good grasp on the library's budget, since they will need to report financial information on the state-required annual survey. Many directors write grants for their libraries, and while the director doesn't need a degree in accounting, having a good grasp of basic math skills, as well as a basic understanding of budgeting and record-keeping, bookkeeping, certainly comes in handy for directors. In the previous slide, it was noted that directors need to oversee the pacing of spending the library's budget throughout the year. The director is responsible for divvying out the monthly allocations and making the monthly purchases for books and other materials, programming costs, staffing expenses, etc. If you divide your total budget into 12 months, you'll see that it equals 8.3333%. So if you set a target of spending 8.33% of your budget each month, you'll be able to stay on track, barring any emergencies. This slide gives you a general look at where your total budgetary spending should be at the end of each month of the fiscal year, which you'll recall runs from July 1st through June 30th. Realize that some large annual expenditures, such as insurance premiums or contract fees, may cause a perceived disruption, but take them into account with the overall budgetary picture. The state library's role in your budget is to provide your Enrich Iowa funding, as we already noted in a previous slide, and to provide consulting assistance with any of your budget-related questions. We also provide continuing education regarding budgetary topics, such as this module you're viewing now. Let's do a little review of how these roles all come together to make a good teamwork operate with your library's budget. If you have completed the library law endorsement course, you will recall that your library's ordinance is like the library's birth certificate. It's the legal document that created your library in your city. That ordinance is based upon state law, specifically Section 392.5 of Iowa Code. Assuming that your library is set up with an administrative board, and all but 3 of Iowa's 500 plus libraries are set up this way, the library's ordinance should state that the library board has authority over the library's budget, that it is the organization that approves expenditures and controls gifts and bequests to the library. This authority is granted by Section 392.5 of Iowa Code, which says a library board may accept and control the expenditure of all gifts, devices, and bequests to the library. While the board controls the expenditures, it is the city that controls the purse strings and allocates how much of a budget your library can expend. Unless, of course, you happen to be an endowed library, in which case you likely are not dependent entirely upon the city for your entire funding. but you may still rely on the city for partial funding. Those libraries are definitely in the minority. Talk with your district consultant if you're the director of an endowed library. It's very important to understand the library board's role regarding the library's finances and to likewise understand the city's role regarding the library's funding. Too often, when these roles are not properly understood, the tug of war argument over money occurs, and that's never a good thing. This at-a-glance slide gives you an overview of the roles we just discussed in previous slides. One thing to be aware of, your city council will still likely approve the library's submitted bills. While the city clerk and the city council should be kept informed of the library's expenditures and the status of the library's budget on a monthly basis, the council has no real legally recognizable power to disapprove expenditures already approved by the library board. That being said, we at the state library advise librarians and library trustees of the following information from the Iowa League of Cities as provided in their clerk's manual. After the library board approves library bills and the general operation of the library director should coordinate information with the city finance officer to ensure the bills are added to the list of claims provided to the city council and published. This ensures that the expenditures are published in accordance with requirements in the Iowa Code and that the general ledger is kept current. While this is not mandated, both the auditor of the state and the State Library of Iowa encourage this preferred method. As with any other department, the library cannot spend more than has been allocated unless the budget is formally amended. Accordingly, the library and the city must work together to determine whether a formal budget amendment is required to account for possible expenditure overages or unanticipated revenues. It is often beneficial for the city council to receive a monthly or quarterly financial report from the library board to help ensure the library's budget is fiscally sound. That again is from the city clerk's manual from the Iowa League of Cities. Although the library board has more autonomy than most city departments, it is short-sighted to think of the library as separate from the city. It is better to think of the city and library as a team working together to make life in your community the best that it can be. If you noted in previous slides, it is the role of the city clerk or city finance officer, if you have one, to write checks on behalf of the library in order to pay for the library staff and the library's bills. If your library, the director or a trustee, is writing its own checks and handling its own checking account, you need to correct this situation. The state library recommends that the city do the financial accounting, write checks for the library's expenditures after authorization by the board, and submit monthly financial reports to the board. The Iowa League of Cities and the State Auditor's Office will advise you the same way. You are putting your library board in a very liable situation if you are asking a trustee to be responsible for writing checks and managing payroll. Our state law librarian has provided us with this information. From a legal standpoint, it is best to let the city absorb the liability for financial transactions, especially payroll. If the trustees pay the bills and payroll, the individual trustees can be sued. If the city pays the bills and payroll, the city gets sued. The Iowa League of Cities and most city attorneys insist that the city handle all financial transactions for its agencies, including the payroll, in order to reduce the city's legal liabilities. Talk with your district consultant about how to correct this situation if your library is currently doing its own bill paying and own check writing. Let's cover our final learning objective now, identifying accreditation standards that pertain to your library's funding aspects. As a brief reminder, the accreditation program is overseen by the state library as a means of determining state funding for public libraries based upon the library meeting specific standards as outlined in this book, In Service to Iowa, which is available on our website. As we earlier reviewed the various roles of the team players in the library's budget process, we saw that the city's and the county's team role is funding, that the board's role is governance, and the director's role is management. Here's a rundown of how those roles are defined in the state standards book, which is In Service to Iowa. The numbers in parentheses represent the number of the current coinciding standard. Here's a rundown of the standards that pertain to city-county funding. You can look up each of these standards in the In Service to Iowa book that I noted on the previous slide. Next, these are the standards that pertain to the library board's role within the budgetary process. And finally, here are the standards that pertain to the director's role regarding the library's budget. Very few of our standards actually address how your budget should be spent, since it is the board's role to determine that. However, standard number 32 does put a percentage on the amount of new materials you add to your physical library collection each year. It says, the library purchases or adds materials at regular intervals throughout the year. On average, 3% or more of the collection is added each year. Standard 40 is a similar kind of standard. It doesn't tell you how much to spend, but it does dictate that the library budgets for computer replacement on a regular basis. Remembering who all is part of your team and allowing or encouraging each to do its specific role regarding your library's finances can make the budgeting process much smoother. Remember that these entities should not be battling each other, but instead should truly view themselves as team players whose goal it is to provide the best possible library services for your community's residents. This concludes our module about free libraries aren't free.